God's preparation is never wasted. When He calls, He equips. When He promises, He provides. But before the provision comes, there is always preparation. Some of you are in that season right now. You're waiting, wondering, praying, and perhaps even struggling to understand why the blessing hasn't arrived yet. But hear this today, God is not delaying your blessing. He is preparing you to receive it. Think about Joseph. God gave him a dream, a vision of leadership and influence. But before he could step into the palace, he had to walk through the pit, the prison, and years of uncertainty. Was God absent in those moments? No, He was shaping Joseph's character, refining his faith, and positioning him for the very thing He had promised. Or consider Moses, raised in Pharaoh's palace, educated among royalty, yet sent to the wilderness for 40 years before leading Israel to freedom. Why? Because the Moses who lived in luxury wasn't yet ready for the calling. God needed to teach him humility, patience, and reliance on divine power before he could carry the weight of leadership. And then there's David, anointed as king in his youth, yet running for his life before ever touching the throne. Why did God allow that? Because battles in the wilderness prepare warriors for the kingdom. David had to learn how to depend on God, how to trust Him in adversity, and how to lead with wisdom before he could wear the crown. Maybe you're facing a season of waiting right now. Maybe you're looking at your circumstances and wondering, Lord, where is the provision You promised? But know this, if God has placed a dream in your heart, if He has spoken a word over your life, He is faithful to complete it. But first, He must complete the work in you. Your season of preparation is not a punishment, it is a process. God is stretching your faith, deepening your trust, and strengthening your endurance so that when the provision comes, you will be ready to carry it. Don't despise the waiting. Don't resist the refining. Stand firm, because when God prepares you, His provision is not far behind. Trust Him. Keep walking. Your blessing is on its way. God's way of working is often different from what we expect. When we ask for provision, we expect immediate answers, quick breakthroughs, and instant results. But God does not simply give blessings. He prepares us to receive them. Before He entrusts us with something great, He makes sure we are ready to handle it. His preparation is a vital part of His provision. Without it, the blessing could become a burden. Many times we find ourselves praying for something, a new opportunity, a financial breakthrough, a healed relationship, a deeper calling, but instead of receiving it immediately, enter into a season of waiting. In that waiting, we may feel frustrated, discouraged, or even forgotten. But the truth is, God is never inactive. What may seem like a delay is actually divine preparation. He is working behind the scenes, aligning circumstances, refining our hearts, and strengthening our faith so that when the provision comes, we will be able to sustain it. Consider a farmer who sows seeds into ground. He does not expect a harvest the next morning. He understands that growth takes time, that the soil must be prepared, that the right conditions must be met before the crop is ready to be gathered. In the same way, God does not just drop blessings into our laps without first cultivating our hearts, shaping our character, and ensuring that we are capable of stewarding what He gives us. Look at Joseph. He was given a dream of greatness, but before stepping into leadership, he went through years of hardship, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. At first glance, it would seem like everything was working against him, but in reality, everything was working for him. Every trial, every setback, every long night in that prison cell was preparing him for the position God had in store for him. When Pharaoh finally called him out of the dungeon and placed him in charge of Egypt, Joseph was not just a dreamer anymore. He was a leader who had been refined through trials. Without that preparation, he would not have been able to handle the weight of the provision. Moses had a similar journey. He grew up in Pharaoh's palace, surrounded by power and wealth, but when he acted on his own strength, he failed and ended up in the wilderness. For 40 years, he tended sheep in obscurity, far from the grandeur of Egypt, but during that time, God was preparing him. The wilderness was not a punishment, it was a place of preparation. It was there that Moses learned humility, patience, and dependence on God. So when the time came for him to stand before Pharaoh and lead the Israelites to freedom, he was not the same man who had fled Egypt years earlier. He was a man who had been shaped by God. David was anointed as king while he was still a young shepherd, but instead of taking the throne immediately, he spent years running from Saul, hiding in caves and facing battles that tested his faith. Why did God allow that? Because David needed to be prepared. If he had stepped into kingship too soon, he would not have had the wisdom, endurance, or dependence on God that he needed to lead a nation. Every hardship, every season of waiting, and every trial prepared him for the promise. God does the same with us. Sometimes we wonder why certain doors remain closed, why the answer hasn't come, or why we are still waiting for the breakthrough we have prayed for. But if we could see what God sees, we would understand that He is not withholding blessings, He is preparing us for them. He is strengthening our faith, teaching us endurance, refining our character, and positioning us for something greater than we can imagine. What we perceive as a delay is actually a process of preparation. If we receive something too soon, we may not have the maturity, wisdom, or spiritual strength to handle it properly. Just as a child cannot be given responsibilities beyond their ability, God does not give us more than we are ready for. His provision comes at the right time, not just when we think we need it, but when He knows we are truly prepared for it. Instead of growing weary in the waiting, we should embrace God's preparation. Every challenge, every delay, and every lesson is shaping us for the future He has planned. God does not waste time. He uses it to mold us into the people He has called us to be, so that when the provision comes, we will be ready to walk in it with faith, wisdom, and strength. Throughout history, God has demonstrated that before He brings someone into their calling, He first prepares them through trials, challenges, and seasons of waiting. The Bible is filled with examples of men and women who had to walk through difficult seasons before stepping into their God-ordained purpose. These stories serve as powerful reminders that the journey to receiving God's provision often involves a process of preparation. He does not immediately place people into positions of influence, leadership, or blessing without first refining them through experiences that shape their character, faith, and dependence on Him. Joseph was given a dream of leadership at a young age, but before he could step into that calling, he faced betrayal, slavery, false accusations, and imprisonment. If God had immediately placed him in power, Joseph might not have had the wisdom, patience, and humility needed to lead a nation through famine. Instead, God allowed him to experience suffering so that when the time came, he would be a leader who understood what it meant to trust God through hardship. Every difficulty he endured served a purpose. His years in prison were not wasted. They were a training ground where he developed the endurance and wisdom necessary for the role he would one day fulfill. Moses is another example. As a young man, he had a desire to help his people, the Israelites, but he acted impulsively and killed an Egyptian, thinking he could bring about deliverance in his own strength. As a result, he fled to the wilderness, where he spent 40 years as a shepherd. To many, it might have seemed like his purpose had been lost, that he had been cast aside and forgotten. But in reality, God was preparing him. The wilderness was his classroom. During those years, he learned humility, patience, and total dependence on God. When the time was right, God called him to return to Egypt and lead his people to freedom. Had Moses not gone through those years of preparation, he would not have been ready to face Pharaoh, lead Israel through the Red Sea, or guide them through the wilderness journey. His time in obscurity was necessary for the responsibility that awaited him. David's story follows a similar pattern. He was anointed as king while still a young shepherd. Yet instead of immediately taking the throne, he spent years running for his life from King Saul. He lived in caves, fought battles, and faced moments of fear and discouragement. Why would God allow his chosen king to go through such hardship? Because David needed to be shaped into the kind of leader who would trust God completely. If he had taken the throne too soon, he might have relied on his own strength rather than seeking God's guidance. Those years in the wilderness prepared him for the responsibility of ruling Israel. When he finally became king, he led with wisdom and a heart that was deeply dependent on God. Even in the New Testament, this pattern continues. The Apostle Paul did not step immediately into ministry after his dramatic conversion. Instead, he spent years growing in his understanding of the gospel before embarking on his missionary journeys. God took time to prepare him, to deepen his faith and understanding, so that when he began his ministry, he would be strong enough to endure persecution and remain faithful to his calling. These examples are not just ancient stories, they are lessons for today. When God places a calling on someone's life, he first prepares them for it. He does this through trials, waiting periods, and challenges that test their faith and refine their character. No one is exempt from this process. It is easy to become frustrated during times of waiting, to question why things are taking so long, but if Joseph, Moses, David, and Paul had to go through seasons of preparation, then we should not be surprised when we experience the same. God knows what lies ahead, and he understands what is required for us to step into his plan successfully. If we try to rush the process, we may step into something we are not fully equipped for. But when we trust his timing and allow him to prepare us, we will be able to walk in his provision with the wisdom, strength, and endurance needed to fulfill our calling. The trials, delays, and challenges are not meaningless. They are the very tools God uses to shape us for the future he has prepared. Waiting is one of the most challenging aspects of faith. It is in the waiting that doubts arise, patience is tested, and faith is stretched. But waiting is not a punishment. It is a process. It is the place where God refines, strengthens, and molds his people so they are ready for what he has planned. Every season of waiting in life serves a purpose. What may feel like a delay is actually divine preparation. Many people struggle with the idea of waiting because they equate it with inactivity or being forgotten. When prayers seem unanswered and doors remain closed, it is easy to question whether God is still listening. But throughout Scripture, God repeatedly shows that He is not absent in the waiting, He is working. When He calls someone, He first prepares them, and that preparation often involves waiting longer than expected. This is because true growth takes time. Just as a seed must remain in the soil before it sprouts, God allows His people to remain in seasons of waiting until they are ready to bear fruit. Joseph waited in prison for years before his moment of breakthrough. He could have easily become bitter or lost hope, but he remained faithful. What seemed like wasted time was actually a season of preparation. While in prison, he developed leadership skills, learned patience, and deepened his trust in God. If he had been released too soon, he would not have been ready to lead Egypt through a famine. His waiting was not wasted, it was essential to his destiny. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before stepping into his calling. He likely wondered if he had missed his purpose, but God was not finished with him. Every day he spent tending sheep was part of the training that would prepare him to lead an entire nation. The waiting was not punishment, it was a refining process that shaped him into the leader God needed him to be. David was anointed as king at a young age, but he did not take the throne immediately. Instead, he spent years running from Saul, facing battles and enduring hardships. It would have been easy for him to question why God allowed such struggles after calling him to be king. But those years of waiting built his character, strengthened his reliance on God, and prepared him for the responsibility of ruling a nation. If David had become king without that preparation, he might not have had the wisdom or humility needed to lead well. God's timing is never rushed. He does not simply give blessings when people ask for them. He gives them when they are ready to handle them. If something is received too soon, it can become a burden instead of a blessing. Waiting ensures that when the promise is fulfilled, it will be fully embraced and stewarded correctly. During seasons of waiting, faith is tested. It is easy to trust God when everything is happening quickly, but real faith is demonstrated in the quiet seasons when nothing seems to be changing. It is in these moments that trust must go deeper. God is not just interested in the outcome, He is interested in the person being shaped in the process. He wants to see perseverance, humility, and unwavering trust develop before the blessing arrives. Many people in the Bible were called by God, but had to go through long periods of waiting before stepping into their calling. The waiting was not a sign of rejection, but a sign of preparation. If God had allowed them to step into their purpose immediately, they would not have been fully equipped to handle it. The same principle applies today. When God has a plan, He prepares first. Embracing the waiting process changes the way seasons of delay are viewed. Instead of frustration, there can be peace in knowing that God is working even when it is not visible. Instead of impatience, there can be trust in His perfect timing. The waiting is not about withholding something good, it is about making sure the person receiving it is fully ready to carry it. God does not waste time, and He does not make mistakes. If He is allowing a season of waiting, it is because He is preparing something far greater than imagined. The process is not easy, but it is necessary. Those who trust God through the waiting will one day see that every moment was part of His perfect plan. Trusting in God's timing and process is one of the greatest challenges in a life of faith. People often want immediate results, instant breakthroughs, and quick answers to their prayers. But God does not operate on human schedules. He's the full picture, while people only see a small part of it. What may seem like an unnecessary delay or an unanswered prayer is actually God's way of orchestrating events for the right moment. His timing is always perfect, even when it does not align with human expectations. Waiting for God's provision can be difficult, especially when circumstances seem to contradict His promises. It is easy to trust Him when everything is going smoothly, but true faith is built in the seasons when nothing seems to be happening. When prayers seem unanswered, when doors remain closed, when the path forward is unclear, those are the moments when trust is truly tested. God's process often involves refining, stretching, and teaching dependence on Him rather than on personal strength or understanding. Joseph had to trust God's timing even when his situation looked hopeless. After receiving a dream that he would one day lead, he was thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. Year after year passed, and yet the dream remained unfulfilled. It would have been easy for him to assume that God had forgotten him. But even in prison, Joseph remained faithful. He trusted that God was still working even when he could not see it. When the right time came, he was elevated to a position of leadership in Egypt. If he had been released from prison too soon, he would not have been in the right place to interpret Pharaoh's dream and step into his calling. God's timing was perfect. Moses also had to trust in God's process. After fleeing Egypt, he spent 40 years in the wilderness before God called him to lead the Israelites to freedom. That season of waiting was not wasted. It was necessary preparation. If Moses had been called too soon, he would not have had the patience, humility, or faith required for such a demanding task. God was not ignoring him. He was preparing him. When the right time came, Moses was ready to stand before Pharaoh and lead God's people out of slavery. David, after being anointed as king, had to trust God's timing through years of difficulty. He could have tried to take the throne by force, but instead he chose to wait for God's plan to unfold. While running from King Saul and living in exile, he had opportunities to take matters into his own hands, but he refused to act outside of God's timing. He understood that the process was just as important as the promise. When he finally became king, he ruled with wisdom and faithfulness because he had been shaped by years of trusting in God's plan. Trusting God's timing requires surrender. It means letting go of personal agendas and believing that he knows best. It is in the waiting that character is refined, patience is developed, and faith is strengthened. When things do not happen according to personal expectations, it is not because God is withholding good things. It is because he is preparing something far better than imagined. Many times people try to rush ahead of God, forcing doors open instead of waiting for his perfect timing. But when things are obtained outside of his will, they often become burdens rather than blessings. God does not simply want to give good things. He wants to give them at the right time when they can be fully appreciated and stewarded well. The waiting period is not about denial, it is about preparation. Even when nothing seems to be changing, God is working. His timing is never too early or too late. What looks like a delay is often divine alignment. Trusting in his process means believing that he is arranging every detail for the right moment. It is knowing that he is preparing hearts, opening the right doors, and setting things in place. When the time is right, his provision will come, and it will be clear that his plan was worth the wait. Faithfulness in the waiting season is one of the greatest demonstrations of trust in God. It is easy to remain hopeful when promises are fulfilled quickly, but true faith is revealed when there seems to be no movement, no breakthrough, and no sign of change. God calls his people to remain steadfast even when circumstances appear unchanged. Those who continue to walk in faith despite delays and trials position themselves to receive his provision at the right time. Many people struggle with the idea of waiting because it feels like wasted time. When prayers go unanswered and doors remain closed, discouragement can creep in. But the waiting is not empty, it is a time of preparation. God is not only working on the circumstances, he is working on the person. He strengthens faith, develops perseverance, and deepens reliance on him. Those who stay faithful during the waiting season are the ones who experience the fullness of his provision when it arrives. Joseph remained faithful even when life seemed unfair. Betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and thrown into prison for a crime he did not commit, he had every reason to give up. He could have allowed bitterness to take root, but instead he chose to trust God. Even in prison, he remained diligent and faithful, using his gifts to interpret dreams and serve others. Because of his faithfulness, when the time came for him to be elevated, he was ready. He did not allow his circumstances to dictate his devotion to God. His consistency prepared him for the responsibility that would come later. David's life was filled with waiting and trials before he stepped into his calling as king. After being anointed, he did not immediately take the throne. Instead, he faced years of hardship, including being pursued by Saul, living in caves, and enduring battle after battle. He had moments where he could have taken shortcuts, but he chose to trust God's timing. He continued to honor Saul even when Saul sought to destroy him. He remained faithful in every season, and when God finally placed him on the throne, he ruled with wisdom, integrity, and dependence on the Lord. His faithfulness in the waiting season shaped him into the leader God needed him to be. Moses, after fleeing Egypt, spent 40 years in the wilderness before God called him back to lead Israel. He could have assumed his time was over, that his purpose had passed, but he remained faithful in the small tasks of tending sheep. What seemed like an ordinary, forgotten life was actually preparation for something much greater. Because he remained faithful when God called him through the burning bush, he was ready to obey. The years of waiting were not wasted. They were necessary to develop the character and endurance required to lead an entire nation. Faithfulness is not just about waiting, it is about how one waits. It is choosing to trust God even when there is no immediate evidence that he is working. It is continuing to pray, serve, and walk in obedience even when nothing's to be changing. Many people give up too soon, thinking that God has forgotten them, but those who remain steadfast will see his provision in due time. God never forgets his promises. He sees every act of faithfulness, every prayer, every moment of trust. Nothing goes unnoticed. When the time is right, his provision comes, and it comes in ways that far exceed expectations. Those who stay faithful will not only receive what God has prepared, but will also have the spiritual maturity to handle it well. The waiting season is not just about reaching the destination. It is about becoming the person God has called you to be. The trials, delays, and challenges are not obstacles. They are the very tools he uses to prepare and strengthen his people. The ones who hold on, who trust Him despite the delays, will one day look back and see that every moment was worth it. The faithfulness in the waiting will be rewarded, and His provision will come in ways that reveal His perfect timing, wisdom, and love. God's preparation always comes before His provision. Every trial, every delay, and every challenge is part of His perfect plan to shape and refine those He calls. He does not withhold blessings out of cruelty, but out of love, ensuring that when His provision arrives, it is received with wisdom, gratitude, and the maturity to handle it well. The waiting season is not a punishment, it is a season of growth, trust, and preparation. Looking back at the lives of Joseph, Moses, David, and so many others, it becomes clear that God never abandoned them in the waiting. He was working behind the scenes, orchestrating every detail, preparing them for what was to come. The same is true today. If He is making you wait, it is because He is preparing something greater than you can imagine. So trust Him, trust His process, His timing, and His wisdom. Stay faithful even when things seem uncertain. Walk in obedience even when the path is unclear, because when the time is right, His provision will come, and it will be far greater than anything you could have achieved on your own. When that moment arrives, you will look back and see that every trial, every delay, and every hardship was part of His perfect plan to prepare you for the blessing He always intended to give.